Hello and welcome to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host Richard Lipman. Today we are interviewing David Borenstein, sponsored by Camera Museum of London at 44 Museum Street. Yeah, it's going good. Yeah, there were a lot of different Zoom links. Thanks for joining me. How's it going?
Going well. It's going well. Yeah, man. Just here in Florida, Gainesville, Florida. Where are you?
I'm in London.
London. Delightful. I was supposed to be living in London right now.
How so?
I was working on, well, I still am working on a three-part series for a UK production company. And before the pandemic, the production schedule had it so that starting, I don't know, last November, I would have been doing post in London. It was such a big series. I was going to be there for like a year.
Wow. What's the series?
It's on tech and science in China, actually. It's with Windfall Productions in the UK.
Okay. Fantastic. And how did you get to America? Were you allowed to fly back from China? Are you living currently? What's the situation?
Yeah. Well, prior to the pandemic, I had moved back to the United States. I had a daughter here, and so I came back to be with my parents. And I spent my entire 20s living abroad. So I decided to come back, and I'm also their only child, so went back to be with them and let them be a grandparent.
I read on your profile that yes, you were originally you studied, you were a scholar in China, and then you turned to filmmaking. Can you tell us how that happened?
Well, I graduated from university in 2009, and I got a Fulbright scholarship to go do research there. But I was a terrible scholar there. I ended up spending most of that year just playing in a band in Southwest China in Chengdu. So they didn't like me very much, but it was good education. I started filming all the band shows and like all the other shows of like the bands that we played with all the time, and got into film that way. Southwest China and China in general has a really cool art scene. There's just so many cool filmmakers, and really it was just such a vibrant scene in Southwest China. And so I just got really inspired. And I think prior to coming to China, I never saw myself as someone that was potentially going to enter a career in the arts, but just being so inspired by what was around me, I got into film, and then just got into film in a variety of ways.
And in America, you were studying what and where? Which uni and what were you studying?
So for undergraduate, I was at University of Florida. I studied Chinese language and political philosophy. And then I had a little interlude in a PhD program at City University, New York, where I was studying anthropology. It was just like very, because it was a very left department. It was that the CUNY still today was America's like most left anthropology department with people like Neil Smith and David Harvey there. It was a pretty cool place.
Right. And initially, what did you learn there? Was there anything that stuck in your mind with regards to in connection with what you're doing today?
Well, definitely. I was studying urbanization in China back then, and my first film kind of came out of that. Dream Empire, which is a film that I made 8 years ago. It was kind of the first big thing that I ever did. And it was really influenced by these classes that I was taking in my PhD program with, this guy David Harvey was one of America's, or one of the world's most like preeminent like Marxist thinkers today. And it was definitely that kind of. I never was like that big of like a aesthetic Marxist, like, but in terms of the theory in it, it's really, to me, it's really interesting and really inspiring to what I do, looking at things dialectically.
And how does that compare to China? Does China relate in connection with the theory that you studied?
I think so. Yeah, I think one of the big influences for looking at China for me, if we want to, if I rarely talk about the academic background kind of thing, but if you want to go in that direction,
A little bit, yes. Why not?
sure. What one of the big things for me looking at China in the very beginning, because I was in China living there for so long during a period of really great transformation where we saw just social relations being absolutely transformed throughout the country by marketization and by the increased kind of culture of consumption that was sweeping over countryside areas. And I think a lot of people who were in China studies and who also were filming China and still do film China do so through this very kind of culturalist lens. They go there looking for the exotic, and they go there looking for something that's very different and freaky from what we have. But I think with that kind of more Marxist angle, with that angle of looking at the economy and not really thinking about culture as something that as is, but looking at culture as something that is potentially shaped by the work that we do every day, that's shaped by this economic system that we're in, I think it was a more fruitful way of looking at China. Because there was so much in common with us and China. That was kind of what was more interesting to me, was how this marketization and how this kind of culture of consumption that was sweeping China, especially 15 years ago, how that was creating styles of life that were kind of banal in exactly the same ways as they were in the United States. It was way more interesting to see Chinese people just like how they interacted in Starbucks than it was to look for like people playing traditional instruments to me. That was just something that I found to be interesting.
I see. Okay, so your approach is much more modern. It's much more now. It's much more about what's going on. How did you cope though? Did you speak Chinese?
I did. My major in my university was Chinese, and I did a lot of training before I moved there.
And how were you greeted? Do you feel like a foreigner, or did you manage to fit in, or meet people easily, or travel around? How was it?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the easiest foreign countries I've ever lived in terms of making friends. When I was a university student, spending my summers in China studying, I used to just walk up to like all the apartment buildings in China. They have security guards that are just there drinking tea, watching TV, just sitting in a little booth. And I would just every night just go up to a random one and start talking with people. And they all have so much time over there. There's a lot of curiosity about talking to people from the West. People want to learn in China, and people had a lot of patience. It was just, for me, China was just always a really welcoming, really wonderful place for both making friends and learning the language.
That's very, very positive. I'd like to know what makes you choose a story?
Yeah, it's usually connected. Well, there's two different approaches. It's usually connected to what I'm reading. I still have like I do have a bit of an academic approach, and I do a lot of reading, and I do a lot of kind of just keeping up with various literature and anthropology. Kind of when I dropped out of my PhD program, I reasoned to myself that I would keep up with the literature and I would contribute some other way. But doing that is an advantage because anthropology is a very nice field that a lot of people are doing really interesting research, looking at things, and not a lot of it gets out to a public. So if you're a filmmaker that is kind of keeping up with the literature a little bit, you can be kind of really thinking about what other people are thinking about and be thinking about doing stuff like that for yourself. Then the other dimension is I'm working a lot as like in the production industry. So I'm doing some films myself that I direct, but I also, for me, it's really important to be working in every capacity. So I work as a line producer, I work as a producer. I do a lot of stuff that's just not directing. I also do stuff in TV news and things like that. My approach has always been to cast a wide net. And that's been really helpful for me because it allows me to meet more people and just be out in the world talking to people. Even if you're not making a film that you think is something that's creatively really interesting, you can always go back and film them again if it inspires you to do it that way, which is actually precisely how this New York Times piece was. It was I encountered those companies through work that was like more news, and I knew I wanted to come back and just do it in a more creative way.
Interesting. Yeah, Werner Herzog, preachers, read. That's where you're going to get your ideas and stories, and it will help you sort of mold stories together by, reading all sorts of literature, which sounds like exactly what you're doing. How do you make the contacts when you're working in production? Was that a challenge when you first moved to China?
Let me say one more thing about the reading. Yeah. I was inspired about reading from, you probably know this guy, Victor Kozakovsky.
Tell us about him.
I went to I did this IDFA summer school, 8 years ago, where they match you with mentors, and Victor Kozakovsky was a mentor. And I think we were interviewing him, or just we were with him, and he said the only thing you need to do is read thick books. He just said the only thing you need to do for documentary is read thick books. Which was interesting to me. But I've met a lot of documentary filmmakers who are really inspiring to me that say things like that, that emphasize that maybe watching other films isn't as important as reading. And for me, just naturally, that I like that advice, because that's kind of what I do. I do read more than I watch, actually.
And I'm sure you enjoy it as well. That's important.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, it's just a natural thing. But the other question was what? It was
when in China, what was the challenge of moving into production? I see that you work as a line producer, as a producer, you work in news. How do you make all those contacts? How do you get the gigs? How does that begin?
Oh, it's a huge pain in the ass. I mean, my journey in Chinese media is a long and just crazy journey. In the very beginning, when you're in China and you're a foreigner who speaks a little bit of Chinese or a lot of Chinese, if you speak any Chinese, their TV stations are going to find you. These like local Sichuan television stations or Hunan satellite, just these stations are going to cast you as being some sort of weird or crazy character on a show, on a game show. So my first interaction with the world of media, really, it was kind of happening at the same time as I was filming these shows with the band I was playing in China. I was filming those, but then I was gaining kind of this crazy insight into the world of Chinese television by being cast as the main character on a dating show, being cast as a character on Tibetan Idol of all things. It's like the Tibetan version of American Idol, a bunch of other game shows. So I started kind of doing these weird shows, but meeting a lot of people in the media industry in China at the same time. And I was doing them for fun and for some money, but I kind of kept some of those contacts that I made and converted them into contacts that I continued to film with for stuff that I wanted to do more on. So a lot of those people became kind of like in-betweens between me and Chinese authorities who handle permissions. And the next thing I knew, I was helping foreigners come to film stuff in China, which got me more work in the documentary industry and allowed me to learn more. That was like all 10 years ago. But that's kind of how I cracked into the industry and how I started building a network in China.
What was permissions like, though? As a US citizen, did you have to apply for some sort of work visa?
For a while, it was pretty complicated how I was working over there. I was working mainly on these like short-term visas. So every single production would have its own visa. And that's kind of still the scheme that I'm on today. So after a while of being there based more on this kind of study visa, I transferred to this kind of like this J2 scheme where you're doing this J2 journalist visa, where you're doing a new visa for every production, which is a huge pain. And so it takes a lot of work. And you're constantly your life becomes just a succession of visa runs and just going down to Hong Kong and back and forth and back and forth. So that's kind of how it worked out legally. But yeah, it's just constant applications into the Chinese government.
So you were in the southwest of China. Did you live anywhere else?
I'm very much a partisan of Southwest China, when it comes to the Beijing versus Shanghai versus anywhere else kind of expat battles over what's the best place. I will argue for Chengdu all day long.
Why?
Just it's the freest culture in China. It's got, I think now it's got the best bands. It's got people from all over China that want to go live in a kind of slightly cheaper place and a freer place. It's got the strongest LGBT scene in China, which I think is great. It's just a free place, and the food's good, and it's got the best access to nature out of all the cities in China. It's the place to be.
Wow. How did Love Factory come about? Can you tell us the story? Did you approach the New York Times OpDocs about it, or did you not? Or did you go ahead and produce it or shoot it and direct it? How did that happen?
Yeah, so no, I didn't approach New York Times until after I filmed everything. I guess I had them in my mind as a possible place to release the film because I had worked with them before. But no, when I was filming it, I had not worked with them yet. The funding of it came actually from the Danish Film Institute, which is this. I have this Danish connection that is beyond the China connection. In between living in China and being based in America, I was based in Denmark for a few years. And although still going to China all the time, and I have some contacts in the Danish film industry and have been working with them a bit. And so actually it came from Danish public funding, the money for this film. And it came on this scheme that they were giving money to people who were making creative web videos, like short videos that were intended for release on the web. So because of that, I was thinking New York Times from the beginning, just because I haven't worked with really any other platform for releasing web videos, although I'm sure there are others, and I would have looked into others if it didn't work out with them. So that was the kind of production background of it. It was all public funding. And then the actual production in China, like I said before, me and an old production partner who I used to work with in China had contacts with these companies through a news piece that was from before.
Yes.
And we went in and we contacted, I think, 4 or 5 different companies that we had contacts with, and we spread a wide net. We filmed probably 4 or 5 different characters who could have been the main character.
Yeah.
And at the end, we stuck with Jean, and we didn't really decide it until when we were filming it. It was pretty clear to me that Jean would become the main character, but that wasn't firmly established until after the shoot. We cast a really wide net.
What were the complications of filming and finding and being given access?
I think the most surprising thing is that there wasn't complications. I was pretty open about what I wanted to film and what I thought was interesting. I mean, this kind of wholesale commodification of our relationships, this training of these employees to emotionally manipulate the users using cutting edge science and data. I wanted to film this, and I was scared that there would be complications by explaining this to characters such as the woman Black Fox. She's the CEO in the film. I was really, really frightened that we would have to really cast a wide net and approach many people before someone said yes. But they were all pretty proud of what their companies were doing. I think exactly what the film shows is that when they watch it, they're just seeing cutting edge human resource management and a company that is delivering lots of profits to its shareholders. I think that's what they see, and they're proud of it. So I was surprised. What I wanted to film is what they wanted to show, but we just looked at it in pretty different ways.
And in terms of access, how much access did you have? Did you sort of have 24-hour access or 24/7 access, or did they just say, here's a window, you got 2 hours a day just to come in and we'll show you around? How did it work?
It was 24/7 access with all the characters. That China can be quite, most Chinese companies can be quite generous with access. Actually, it's often hard to get in the front door at the very beginning, but once you're in, I find actually a lot more flexibility with filming Chinese companies than American companies. And there's actually a lot of examples throughout my whole work about that. But yeah. but for these companies, they pretty much just let us hang out. I really prefer filming with a small crew, so it was only 3 of us. And I guess that's relative, but in the world of Chinese productions where it's usually a big foreign crew coming in, 3 is small. So yeah, it was just the 3 of us kind of hanging out, eating grapes, like in her living room. Jinho had a lot of presents that her fans sent her from all over China. And so there's like big baskets of like, all the special products from all the different regions. So her like fans in Sichuan would send her like Sichuanese style, like beef jerky. We'd be snacking on that. But that's what the production environment was like.
And what cameras were you using? Was it one camera or 2?
It was only one camera, an FS7.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you shoot or do you work with a camera person?
There's a DP from Denmark that I've been working on most of my projects. His name is Matthias Newholm Schmidt. He's really great.
Yes, it was very well filmed. Absolutely. That's interesting. So your focus, and of course, you also filmed from the other side, right? You filmed the consumer. Now, I remember one of the characters in your film talked about how he gave a particular character $75,000, and yet, how did he ever amass that kind of money? And then we see him on the furniture sitting next to, we're not quite sure whom. Was this hereditary wealth, or was he a tech genius, or did he have a company? How did all these people make so much money in China? Are there a lot of millionaires, or did you meet a lot of the, consumers of this virtual relationships?
Yeah, I was wondering if it was hereditary wealth. I asked him a lot of questions that was trying to get to the bottom of where his money came from, which he didn't really want to talk about. I was able to gather that he had a high pressure job in Shanghai. So he struck me as a professional class person in Shanghai. So definitely making that amount of money from his job is definitely in the question. But still, that's a lot of disposable income. So it's tough to say where his money came from. But certainly in a city like Shanghai, it's like New York. I mean, professional class people there make a lot of money, and there's a lot of disposable income, and people are looking more and more for ways of connecting with other people online, and this is a way to spend it.
Did you find that virtual relationships is something that's overtaking relationships in China?
I guess it depends who you are. I certainly, Chinese people to me, after living there for a long time, really are, in my opinion, at least my friends there are some of the world's just social butterflies. This living in China and being in a Chinese friend group, I noticed that friends have so many obligations to each other, and people just tend to be really, really good friends there. People probably, maybe even more than other places, people really require the kind of input from relationships that you get. So on that level, it makes sense why people are maybe looking for this online and in China even more than anywhere else. But is it overtaking relationships? I think maybe for some people, maybe for younger people, certainly we were interviewing people who were saying like, listen, this has replaced real life relationships for me. And we have those lines in the film. You can't say it's happening everywhere in China, but to certain demographics, certain personality types, I think you can say it's definitely happening. And also it's worth noting that some sort of similar process can be argued is happening elsewhere as well, not just China.
You say that if friendships require obligations, in China, perhaps more so than in other countries or cultures? What kind of obligations? Can you give us some examples?
All right. So when I'm in Chinese mode, for example, and I am flying into, or let's say I'm in Chinese mode and I'm flying into a city in China, I can just say to a friend, like, you're picking me up, right? And they're like, oh yeah, yeah. Or if I'm in Chinese mode and I have a Chinese friend who's like a friend of mine is flying into a city, I'm going to say, hey, friend, you're going to be watching after my friend when that friend is in town. And I don't need to ask. I just say it. When I'm in American mode, there's more boundaries. I can't assume that a friend of mine is going to pick me up at the airport. I can't assume that a friend of mine is going to have time or be generous enough to take care of another friend of mine when they're in town. There's just more obligations when you're in a Chinese friend group. There's more things that are expected of you, and there's more things that you get in return. That is Chinese friendship for you.
Right. So you had to also look after other people as well. Did that ever conflict with work?
Oh, interesting question. Yeah, I would say it did. Because work relationships are also more complicated in China than they are in the West. It's rare to have it be strictly professional. You're going to end up becoming friends and drinking a lot, and it's kind of a little bit of that culture of that's so famous from Japan or Korea, of just really doing a lot of social activities with the people you work with. For sure, when you have a Chinese crew and people you work with, there's more drama, there's more emotions in it. It's absolutely that way.
That's very interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you give us some examples? That's very interesting.
A
small example, one story,
One story. Oh man, there's so many that it's difficult even to think of, or even to think of one that is. There's the ones that immediately come to mind are ones that are actually emotionally tough. Like one of the people who this is getting a little personal, but one of the people that I worked with on this very Love Factory film, she was a girl that I actually haven't spoken to since then. It was just, we had like a falling out as friends. It had nothing to do with work. And it was just out of not seeing each other enough and just lots of drama on the friend side of thing. And it actually ended up, I haven't worked with her since then. It's fine, but I haven't worked with her since then. And actually, as a working relationship, we were perfectly fine. Like, there was no issues on the working thing. But I don't know. It's just I'm answering like too honestly now. Like, I think this is like something that's like really bothering me.
Confession, come on.
It's like it's like the first thing that came to mind, and it's like something that's like very painful and like terrible. Maybe I shouldn't even say that, but yeah. I mean,
okay, so there was a conflict. I mean, you work well together, but still, that sort of personal working relationship is strenuous, and it it needed to be smoother, right, in order for things to be easier.
Yeah. Let me think of like a better example for you.
Yeah. Yeah. That one could be someone else.
The first thing that came to mind.
Right.
I think it's just a question of always like this pure engagement, always. Like, when you're working, so the people I work with right now in China, members of my crew, as someone that like hires another person, or as someone that's on a team with another person, you're constantly in the process of like being like a psychological kind of earpiece to them, or like a friend in some ways. So like, you don't just work with someone as a professional, you're constantly texting and getting emotional updates from your crew, and you're required to give that input back to them.
What kind of emotional updates would you get, for example?
Oh, I'm like at their 11 p.m. just, I'm so stressed out right now. I'm having problems with my mother. I'm having problems with my father. Just really, people share really, really emotional stuff really quick in China, which is kind of nice. It's a way of building connections with other people. And I like it. I like the amount of emotional openness and how much I know about my crew in China. I know a lot more about my crews in China than crews that I've worked with elsewhere.
Right.
Which makes things complicated. That gets back to what I was just saying. It makes things very complicated.
But I suppose loyalty comes into it, doesn't it?
Yes, loyalty definitely comes into it, which is great. I mean, for me, a big part of working in China also has been for just to do it as Chinese of a way as I can. Like when Westerners go into China and they start a business or they start an operation of any sort, there is this kind of notion that Chinese people are undependable. They might steal your IP and then leave or start their own company. And maybe that's true for them, but that's because they're not doing it like the Chinese way. Like any strong business in China, whether it's Western run or Chinese run, is going to make strong relationships and then have the business grow naturally out of those relationships. So the way of doing business in China is still very, very kind of like old school. Like you have a group of people who you trust, and then those are the people that you work with. Those are the people that you do things with. Those are the and if you just hire random people or you find a random crew, it's not going to be as effective.
It's a bit like that also in in the media in general. I think people work with people they trust and know about. We've got about 10 minutes left. That's very interesting, and I'm very interested in your film as well, that you mentioned, which is hang on a second. I just want to make sure I get it right. Dream Empire. And you've made many, many more, right? Internet of Emotions. You worked with Arte, who great company. They do a lot of great docs. Al Jazeera, Vice. What's it like? Do these platforms, are they fairly demanding in terms of how a product or how something should be at the end? Is their editorial process fairly rigid? What's your experience of this?
I think they could be rigid or not rigid. It just depends on the slot that you're getting at these networks. So my work with Arta has been primarily through their creative documentary slots, which they're really hands-off. Arta has been maybe at the front end. They might give a little bit when especially if it's like a co-production and they're putting a good amount of money in. If they're putting in a lot of money, maybe there'll be a little bit of advice on what they're interested in the beginning, but it's been very, very hands-off in my experience. Now, I think all of these networks that you named, Al Jazeera, Arta, all of them, they're going to have slots and they're going to have shows that are more hands-on. But the ones that you see that I've done, the ones that the films that I'm kind of more proud about and are more like authored by me, those tend to have been on creative documentary slots that are really hands-off.
Interesting. And also you work in radio documentary.
I recently started, yeah.
How's that?
Well, there was a Sundance program, like a lab for documentary filmmakers who wanted to get into radio docs. So I applied and I did my first one with BBC, which is the partner on this program. And then it went well. And so they've just kept inviting me back to do more. And yeah, I think it's great. For me, it's really good for China because there's some topics for China that it's really hard to get permission, but it's so easy to make a radio doc on something that's kind of more sensitive
and I'm wondering, part of it is because of your creative sensibilities with storytelling and because you're able to forge relationships better, and because of is this part of the reason why you're able to sort of move fairly easily from radio to documentary and others? Is this connected?
I don't know. I think maybe it's just desperation, just trying to find a way to make a living in a really tough industry to make a living in.
Right.
And I think the desperation is good. I've learned a lot through doing different things. For sure, the radio docs after doing some of those, I came back to documentary with really new eyes and a fresh perspective. And news, I think it's really, I'm really glad that I haven't had to live my whole career. My whole career I haven't had like an endowment or a fund for just doing creative films. I'm really glad that I've had to bust out a living somehow doing news, doing fixing, doing really weird things. I'm glad. Like I like being a working filmmaker, and I think that like creative work would be much worse if I wasn't doing it. It just brings so much. Doing stuff that looks stupid. Like it trains you to be critical and to think about why it's stupid, and to think about why you want to go back and do something better the next time. It forces you out of your comfort zone.
One example, can you give us one thing that forced you out of your comfort zone, which you appreciated?
There's almost too much, but I mean, really, it was. I'm not gonna. It's tough to say exactly what, because I've been doing some. I don't want to like say anything about other programs, but I did approach Love Factory with another program first, like the characters that are in it, and it was great because it got me out into the world. It got me asking questions. And it got me meeting interesting people. And the entire time that I'm doing it, right, I'm saying I would much rather do it this way. And then you go back and you do it that way. And when you're stewing for a week shoot about, oh, I really would rather do it this way and not this way, that's actually good inspiration.
And yeah, interesting. And what was it like? How did the New York Times platform hear about Love Factory?
So I met them at the CPH Docs forum, which is it's like a film financing forum where you do like these 15-minute meetings between producers, directors, and platforms. And I met them there, although I had already known them from a previous episode, but in that a previous film. But the previous film, I had also met them at a film forum, which was IDFA in Amsterdam.
Interesting. So yeah, festivals are a really good place to meet people and pitch docs and stuff like that.
I agree. Yeah, for me, it's been critical going to these film forums. In a way, I admire and I'm quite jealous of the older kind of executive producer types that don't need to go to them anymore. They can just make a call and they have their financing. But for people who don't have those connections or earlier in their career, for me, for sure, the film financing forums at the festivals have been a great way. It's a fair way too. You just apply. Anyone can apply, and they'll take you.
You get selected, right?
Yeah,
to apply.
Yeah.
Okay, we got a few minutes left. We could always run another Zoom, but if anyone's got any questions, let's see what happens. Anyone any questions for David? Okay, well, David Borenstein, that's just absolutely fantastic talking with you. I'd like to hear about what you're doing next before we move on.
Yeah, next thing that I'm working on is kind of a film that's it's looking like it's going to be inside Huawei. So it's looking at the Chinese company Huawei. It's looking at exactly what it is they do, because a lot of people aren't exactly clear on what it is they do. But it's also looking at what they do, like its connection to the rise of Chinese science and technology, but also kind of getting in the company deep with characters who are real characters and really giving us an insight into the kind of company culture, which is a very, very different type of culture than what people might be used to in the West.
Is this a treatment that you've sort of ironed out, so to speak? Do you have a sort of, what the story is going to be? How much access do you have there as well?
So I wrote a treatment based, kind of how I work is I write a treatment on the big picture things that I want the film to say. So for me, those are the things that I just told you. It's those kind of wanting to understand Huawei as a company, wanting to learn about where exactly is Chinese science and technology, but most importantly, just getting characters in there so you can feel what this company is like, because it's different and people don't know it. But so I know the big things, but I'm not exactly sure what the small things are until I start filming. I've provided kind of Huawei with a list of types of characters that I would like to film, and they've been pretty good about working together. And once the shoot starts, I'll be shooting a bunch of different people, and then maybe some people get nixed, and then other people will be the stars.
Fantastic. David Borenstein, that's the end of the podcast. Thank you very much for joining us. And
yeah, thank you.
We look forward to watching your films in the future. We'll be in touch. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks.
Bye. Should you have any questions, comments, and suggestions, please get in touch. Thank you for listening to A Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Lipman. Sponsored by Camera Museum of London at 44 Museum Street.